Hey guys, welcome to today's summary of our live class. I'm going to run through our lesson from today very quickly, so if you have questions or need more help, please come to my office hours. So first of all, an important reminder that this week is our last week before the end of the 6 weeks term. So next week is the end of that term. So this week is the time to take a look at your grades and make up any missing work. If you have a grade that you're not happy with, I'm going to allow you to resubmit anything that you've turned in so far for more credit, or anything that's missing can still be turned in for credit as well. So like I said, now is the time to look at that, not next week when there's only a day left in the term, but now when you have time to get that done. So if you have questions about your grades, please come to me and I'm happy to do what I can to help you out. Today's supporting question is, how did the desire for land create conflict in colonial America? Remember, our supporting question is like our daily learning target. Our unit compelling question is, was colonial America a democratic society? So over the course of the unit, each individual supporting question is going to be helping us answer that compelling question. In our lesson on Monday, we talked very briefly about Pocahontas, and I've covered that in the live lesson summary from Monday, but just to review again, we talked about the real story of Pocahontas as opposed to the dramatized Hollywood story most of us hear today. She was around 11 years old when the English showed up, and even as a young girl, Pocahontas was able to serve as a translator between the Powhatans and the Englishmen. So we need to think about her as this remarkably brilliant young woman who's able to move in between these two very different communities and pick up on this language skill without tutors, without guidebooks, without teachers, without anyone who even speaks both languages. She's able to pick up on that language. And because of that, she becomes very important in facilitating communication both ways and helping come up with trade arrangements and negotiations between the two different communities. So her role really helps forge a strong relationship in the very early days between these two different societies. That relationship doesn't last long term, but she does play an important role in helping Jamestown succeed in the beginning of the colonization phase. We've all heard the story of Powhatan beginning to execute John Smith and Pocahontas throwing herself over John Smith's body like some kind of lovesick teenager. But what historians really think happened today is that it was a mock execution ceremony designed to dramatize Powhatan's power and their friendship, in which he was going to pretend to execute John Smith because he wanted to show that he had the political authority to do so. But then at the last moment, he would have pardoned John Smith to show that he had the mercy and grace to free him as well. So historians now see part of this as a cultural drama and a showing of power, and not the demonstration of love and intervention that it was portrayed as for so many years. Pocahontas was ultimately married to tobacco planter John Rolfe, and through John Rolfe, she teaches the colonists at Jamestown how to farm tobacco, which becomes the first cash crop for the English in the colonies. So not only does she play a vital role in those early negotiations, she also plays a really important role in ensuring the long-term success of Jamestown. She is taken to England in 1616, and when she's coming back to the colony in 1617, unfortunately, she becomes ill and dies from disease at the age of 22. So first, for our activity today, I'm going to have you take a quick look at some maps of early Virginia. These are some of the earliest maps made by the English. The first map was made in 1636, and the second map was made in 1651. So what I want you to do when you're working through your Nearpod assignment is, on the next slide, I want you to circle two things that represent colonists and two things that represent indigenous populations. If you're following along while you're doing the Nearpod, you should pause now and take a moment to study the map and see what you can find. Okay, I'm going to show you just a couple of things that we talked about in class today. Really, make sure you're coming to our live classes because it's so much more fun and engaging when you can be a part of these discussions. So what you can see is over here, we have an English colonizer holding his rifle. Over here, we have indigenous people with their bows. We've got ships in the water that represent Europeans, big ships with sails. We've got smaller canoes in the water that represent the indigenous people. We have these drawings of different dwellings and community houses that represent the indigenous people. We have the big name, the Powhatan name, coming across labeling this territory on the map as Powhatan territory. We've got names of lots of little villages all over, showing all of the different native communities that are living. We've got lots of trees, lots of animals. There's really a lot of evidence here of the English beginning to come into this area, as well as the lives of the indigenous people who have lived here for generations. Now, on the next map, this map was drawn 15 years later. So what I want you to do on your Nearpod is take a minute to really study this map and see what's different. Are the things that you circled the first time still there? Have they changed? On this map, I want you to circle at least 2 things that you notice to be different. Now is a time to pause and take a little time to see what has changed between the 2 maps. In this map, you can see we have representations of English ships, of colonizer ships, but there are no longer representation of native ships here in the water, no more native boats. We no longer have, we no longer have representations of indigenous people. We no longer have representations of the colonists. And now, if you notice, across the center of the map, front and center, is the name Virginia. So at this point, the English have really staked a claim to call this land theirs. We're not seeing as many trees. We're seeing some animals here, but it doesn't seem like we're seeing quite as many. And it really seems like everything now is focused much more around that English perspective, and we're not seeing the inclusion of the indigenous populations. So we spent a little time discussing this in class. We talked about how it must feel to be one of the indigenous people living in this area at that time, how they are being excluded and pushed out. We talked about how it must feel to be one of the English people. Like, they must feel pretty powerful. They're able to accomplish a lot and take over an enormous amount of territory very quickly. And it's important to point out that in 1491, before Columbus arrived in what is now America, there were over 18 million people, indigenous people, living in North America. In North and South America together, there were about 60 million. And to put that in perspective, there were somewhere between 70 and 88 million people in Europe. So the population numbers for the Americas is a little smaller, but comparatively, it's also very high. It's a largely populated area. And you can see on this map here, as far as the indigenous lands before European arrival, indigenous people lived on every inch of soil that is now in the United States. There were large groups of people that spread out over large areas, and it was a heavily inhabited, highly complex society. There were vast trade networks, vast political organizations, independent nations with their own structures and government. And just like we might have the US and Canada today, our territories meet up each other, but we're very different people. There are definitely cultural similarities between us, but there are also cultural differences. We have our own governments, we have our own policies, we have our own trade agreements with other foreign nations, and it was very much the same with the indigenous people. Individual groups had their own systems of government, their own policy, their own diplomacy, their own cultural or spiritual beliefs. And while there were some similarities between the groups, there were also a lot of differences. And it was not one generalized group of people who lived here, but rather many different nations of people. So when the Europeans first arrived, they're coming into this complex political system already, full of relationships, alliances, disputes that have been going on for thousands of years. Pocahontas, in the early days, even helped the Jamestown colony survive from starvation, taught them how to farm tobacco. So early on, there is an age of cooperation. But unfortunately, this gives way to conflict very quickly. And one of the first areas of conflict between indigenous people and colonizers are concept of land ownership. In previous classes, you might have heard the story of the selling of Manhattan. So the story goes that the Dutch bought the island of Manhattan, which is now parts of modern-day New York City, from the Lenni Lenape for around $24 worth of beads and trade goods. I want you to think about, is this fact or fiction? Do you think this really happened? So what you'll do here is take a minute to vote in the poll. Okay, so there is more to the story. This scenario did happen, but it's more complex than it might seem on the surface. So whether you picked fact or fiction, you're not entirely right or wrong either way. When the Lenape and the Dutch came together, there was a real lack of understanding of the concept of property ownership. To the indigenous people, you couldn't own land any more than you could own air or sunshine that's around you. The land was a gift from the Creator, and it was there for everyone to use. No one person should have the right to own or hold land. It didn't even occur to them that that's something you should do, because for them, the concept of land was much more community based. So individual tribal nations might have cared for and stewarded parts of land, helped to make sure that land was tended to and not overpopulated, and they were moving around and farming appropriately, but they didn't consider themselves an owner. They may be just more like a manager of the land. But the Dutch came in with the Western mindset of property ownership, exclusive rights to a piece of property, so that if you were the owner of the property, you were the only person who had the right to be on there. You could perhaps be a landlord, build a building, have tenants who were also on your property, but when it came down to it, you were the one in charge. So, what happened between the Lenape and the Dutch is that the trade goods were exchanged. So, the Dutch did give the Lenape considerable, little beads, trade goods. You can see in this painting here, this dramatization, where everything that they're giving is fitting within this trunk. What happens, though, is they don't take the time to understand the way that the individual parties are approaching this trade deal. They both assume they're approaching the trade deal with the same set of values and the same set of ideas about property ownership. So what happens is the Lenape immediately engage in similar transactions with other indigenous communities, trying to help maintain shared ownership of the land, shared access to the land, so that people who needed that land were able to access it for resources. And the Lenape saw themselves as sort of the negotiator, just facilitating everything that was going on. So the Dutch, though, they see the Lenape selling this land to other people, and they get really upset and feel like they've been hoodwinked. So the Dutch build a wall around their settlement. The Lenape think, what the heck? We're letting you use this land. We gave you permission to be here, and now you're putting up a wall to keep us out. So immediately you have that conflict because they approach the deal from two different perspectives. And remember in our early cases where we talked about bias and how two people can come into can leave the same situation and have two different understandings about what happened because of their perspective, their point of view could be different. That's exactly what's happening here with the selling of Manhattan. So, just a short period of time, there is fierce armed conflict. And as European colonizers defeated natives in combat, they forced indigenous leaders to sign treaties, giving them even more of their land. So, you just see this perpetuation of land ownership really taking a hold in the Americas. I want you to watch a short video that's a simple case study of King Philip's War, which is another territorial dispute in modern day Rhode Island. So I'm not going to play the video now because you'll have the opportunity to play it when you're working through your Nearpod. After you've watched the video, I want you to answer the open-ended question, which is, how did the desire for land create conflict in colonial America? You will have already thought about this throughout the lesson, so just write your simple answer in here. I'd like you to write one sentence, please. Finally, to wrap us up, Indigenous land is still a major issue in the United States today. You can see from the map that I have here that Indigenous people have been forced into very small areas of land, but there is still some land that is considered Indigenous tribal land. Here in the United States today, there are nearly 7 million Native people still living, which is about 2.09% of our population. And even though many of these Indigenous people have been pushed off of their ancestral homelands, they still maintain really strong ties to the area where ancestors and generations of their ancestors lived before them. And there are 574 federally recognized tribes today in the United States, and these tribes are sovereign nations. They still have their own government that interact with our government and government-to-government level negotiations. And many of these tribes still manage portions of their ancestral land. So Indigenous land is still a major issue today, and your take-home homework assignment for this week asks you to look at land acknowledgement and the importance of us today acknowledging Indigenous lands here in the United States. So if you have questions, I'll be in my office hours, and I will see you in live class next week. Thanks, and have a good night.